And I would first like to introduce myself. I'm Martin Sanchez-Jankowski, for anybody who has joined us and who is new. I'm the director for ISSI, and I, of course, welcome you all to this event today. Before we get started, please check to see your cell phones are turned off or turned to silent mode. And secondly, let me take this opportunity to announce our next event. On Tuesday, March 1st, Anu Gomez, who's associate professor in the School of Social Welfare here at UC Berkeley, will give a talk based on her new research. The talk will be from 4 to 5:30 p.m. in the Voldovsky conference room, which is in our building. As you all know, we will have our speaker speak about 45 minutes and then turn it to questions and answers, and I will be responsible for establishing the queue for him to answer. Let me take this opportunity to introduce to you our speaker today, who is Professor Sam Friedman. He's an assistant professor of sociology at the London School of Economics and Political Science, and he's on the editorial board of Sociological Review and a consulting editor of the Fest, which is the largest magazine covering Edinburgh Festival Fringe. He received his BA from the University of Edinburgh, his MA from the London School of Economics, and his PhD in sociology from the University of Edinburgh. His research focuses on issues of social class and inequality, and particularly the cultural dimensions of contemporary class division. He has written widely on class and culture and is the author of Comedy and Distinction, The Cultural Currency of Good Sense Humor, published by Routledge Press in 2014. His current research examines social mobility in Britain's elite occupations, for which he will talk to us today. And the title of his talk today is The Class Pay Gap in Higher Professional and Managerial Occupations. And a much more expanded version of this talk will be coming out in the next edition of the American Sociological Review. Please join me in welcoming Professor Sam Friedman.
Okay, well, first, just want to say a big thank you for the invitation. Makes a nice change from the cold, wet London winter. And also just want to say sorry in advance if you hear any strange noises during this talk. I'm actually here with my wife and my 5-month-old daughter, Cora, who is lurking at the back today, poised to heckle at opportune moments. My talk today is entitled The Class Pay Gap in Higher Professional and Managerial Occupation. And really this lays out analysis that I've been conducting over the last few months with my colleague and Berkeley PhD, Daniel Lorison, about social mobility both into and also within the most prestigious occupational arenas. Now, I've actually been in the US for 3 weeks now and intently watching the presidential nomination debates on TV. I've been intrigued to learn that, just like the UK, social mobility seems to be a real populist vote winner here. Phrases like fairness, opportunity come up again and again in the impassioned speeches that I've been hearing. And this really reflects the fact that both in the US and the UK, mobility has come to be seen as really one of the primary indicators of a just society. A powerful metric that tells us about the openness of our meritocracies. But what I want to talk about today is what happens when we look beyond this sloganeering at what politicians actually mean when they say social mobility. And here the genesis of our work really lies in addressing a conceptual problem that we believe has hampered social mobility research for some time. And that's that in the US, in the UK, and throughout much of the Western world, sociological research tends to conceptualize social mobility as an issue of occupational access, of who gets into the top jobs and how that relates to their backgrounds. Now, while occupational entry is of course clearly important, getting in doesn't necessarily mean getting on. And the problem with the fair access agenda is that it tends to ignore the differences in the resources people bring with them into occupations, as well as the different rewards they reap once there. In this way, most research on mobility, we believe, fails to adequately capture the linger of class origin and how it might affect outcomes beyond occupational entry. So really following this logic, our paper aims to advance really a new way of conducting social mobility research, one that we think is better able to capture and interrogate class origin inequality in the workplace. In particular, we have two main research questions. First, we simply ask, is upward mobility more common in some high-status occupations than others? But second, we move beyond this idea of occupational access to examine how do the upwardly mobile fare once they have actually entered top occupations. Specifically, do they attain the same level of earnings as those from privileged backgrounds? And if not, can this be explained by differences between the two groups? Or does a class ceiling persist even if we compare otherwise similar people from different class backgrounds? I also just wanted to say from the outset, although our data today comes from the UK, we think this approach very much can also be applied to the US. And we're actually currently working with Mike Howe at NYU on some US data, but I'd be very interested in your thoughts on how our results may compare in a US context. Just before I move to the data, I want to just give you some brief context about where these research questions come from and why we think they're important. Now, as I just mentioned, over the last 20 years or so, the goal of increasing social mobility has really become a rare point of political convergence. And sociologists, in Britain at least, have been intimately connected to this agenda, with most research on mobility concerned with calculating average national rates of mobility, and then, to us anyway, seemingly engaging in endless debates about whether mobility nationally is increasing or decreasing. Moreover, when they look at these generalized rates, most researchers tend to follow the lead of John Goldthorpe, and concentrate on examining mobility into what are called the big social classes, So in the US, that would be the EGP schema. In the UK, and what I'll be talking today, is called the National Statistics Socioeconomic Classification, the NSEC. What this means is that we have a lot of data on mobility into large categories of occupations, but at the same time, we might be missing important differences in mobility between occupations, particularly elite or prestigious occupations. Now, the question of how to develop a more occupationally specific analysis of mobility has been advanced here in the US, particularly by David Grusky and his colleagues. In what's known as the microclass thesis, Grusky and colleagues have argued that distinctive differences in mobility do exist between individual occupational groups, particularly when you look at the greater probability that children with parents in specific occupations will follow in the footsteps of their parents. So children of doctors becoming doctors and so on. But one problem with this microclass thesis is that, like big class analysis, it tends to be tied to what are called mobility tables, that track identical origins and destinations. And this means it frequently elides the question of how big class origins may affect microclass destinations. Or, to put in less abstract terms, while a microclass perspective might capture the specialized resources that a doctor may transmit to their children that will advantage them in the field of medicine, it's still important to ask what kinds of resources come from the parent's big class position, their more generalized privilege, and how this affects their children's particular occupational destination. Now, until now, the kind of nationally representative data needed to conduct this kind of analysis, i.e. with large sample sizes and detailed social origin data simply hasn't been available in the UK. However, in late 2014, questions on class origin were included in Britain's largest employment survey, the Labour Force Survey. And really, Daniel and I immediately jumped on this data, and really that allows us here to finally carry out what we believe is a really detailed analysis of mobility into individual elite occupations in Britain. Now, another byproduct of the dominant approach to mobility, as I also mentioned in the introduction, is that it tends to reduce the conversation around social mobility to this issue of occupational admission. Okay? Now, the issue of success within occupations has, of course, been much explored in relation to gender and ethnicity. Okay? With groundbreaking work demonstrating the hidden pay gaps and general glass ceilings faced by women and ethnic minorities in top occupations. And while questions of class origin are largely absent from this work on pay gaps, what we want to do today is to try to import this idea into the field of class analysis to see whether beyond entry the socially mobile continue to face lingering disadvantage. So just to tell you a little bit about the data and the approach, here we're looking specifically at the 63 occupations that fall into Class 1 of Britain's NSX schema that I mentioned. Okay, very similar to EGP, defined as higher professional, managerial and administrative occupations. Okay, this can be further broken down into 1.1, which is higher management, 1.2, which is higher professions. Okay, and as you'll see as I go on, we also break it down into 16 occupational groups, okay, most of which are similar to Grusky's micro-classes. It's also worth saying we're restricting our analysis here to those aged 23 to 69 and not in full-time education. And this gives us a sample of 43,444 in the LFS, 6,104 of whom are in NSEC 1 occupations, and 3,427 of whom also have income data. Very finally, before I get to the actual data, just to tell you how we're measuring social mobility here. So, to measure someone's class origin, we're referring in a rather standard way to the question in the LFS that asks people, what occupation did your main parental earner do when you were 14 years of age? What we then do is, based on these answers, group respondents into 4 categories. Okay, those with NSEC 1 parents are categorized as stable, intergenerationally stable. Those with NSEC 2 parents, okay, nurses, teachers, we call those the short-range upwardly mobile. 3, 4 and 5, okay, shop owners, electricians, we call them the mid-range socially mobile. And those in NSEC 6 and 7, okay, cleaners, labourers, normally considered the working class in the UK, we see them here as the long-range upwardly mobile. And we use these colours throughout the stats, which should hopefully allow you to follow the results. So let's start with looking at how different class backgrounds affect access into elite occupations. Now, this chart basically tells you how overrepresented or underrepresented people from certain class backgrounds are in higher professional and managerial jobs. So higher managerial and professional jobs on the right compared to the backgrounds of the population as a whole. Okay, and what we can see very clearly from this simple chart is that those from advantaged backgrounds in red are nearly twice as common in top jobs than in the general population. Okay, so probably not exactly news to any of you, but clear evidence here of the continuing reproduction of privilege. Next, though, we looked within NSEC 1, okay, to see how open or closed are the 16 particular occupational groups that we are looking at here. Now, the main thing I want you to sort of take away from this slide is really the diversity of backgrounds in different elite occupations. Okay, from law, where nearly 65% are from some kind of professional managerial backgrounds, to public sector managers at the bottom there, where really less than half are from those sorts of backgrounds. But there's also another story here. This table, we think, also suggests a telling distinction between what we're calling the sort of traditional and the technical. Okay, so the traditional, what are sometimes called gentlemanly professions of law, medicine, finance, and media in the UK contain a particularly high concentration of those from privileged backgrounds, whereas technical profession, engineering, IT, and the built environment, okay, town planners, architects, seem to have a much lower proportion, okay? Now, while this analysis clearly demonstrates wide variation in the openness of different elite occupations, it's not able to tell us how those from low origins actually fare once they are within elite occupations. Okay, now, while the LFS doesn't examine exact occupational position, we think looking at earnings represents a relatively reliable proxy for occupational success. So what you can see on this chart here is how average earnings per week vary according to one's class background. First of all, for all of those in NSEC 1, okay, in higher professional managerial jobs, then NSEC 1.1, which is management, and 1.2, which is professions. Now, what you can see really here is that there are significant differences according to origin. Okay? In particular, the intergenerationally stable have a particular advantage, earning on average £133 a week more than the upwardly mobile as a group, and £169 a week more than the long-range upwardly mobile. Okay, well, I can see that this might not actually look like very much on a chart of this kind. What this actually translates to is an average annual difference of nearly £9,000 or $13,000 a year, okay, which when I think about my paycheck anyway, certainly seems significant. Also, interestingly, you can see from the last bar here that the gap is much more acute in the professions rather than management, which we could perhaps pick up on in the questions. But of course, a simple distribution of averages can't tell us whether the mobile face a class ceiling. Okay? It may be, for example, that simply the mobile are different from the stable in other respects. So to interrogate this further, we next conducted a series of regressions on earnings among those in higher professions and management. Okay? Specifically, we regressed weekly earnings on origins, controlling for a set of factors shown in previous research to affect earnings. Okay? And you can see these on the screen now. So there are demographic variables, okay, sex, age, ethnicity, region, whether a respondent lives in an urban area or not. We also look at educational qualifications, what type of degree they have. We also look at human capital, okay, dominant economic explanation for earnings inequality, okay, job training, job tenure. And we also control for a set of other work conditions that may affect earnings, okay? How many hours you work, how big your firm is that you work in, whether you work in the public or the private sector, what industry you work in, and we also then control for the specific occupation that you work in. Now, inevitably, this creates a somewhat giant regression, which I've spared you with in this table. So what the table that I have put on the slide shows you is really what happens to the class pay gap when we add each set of our controls. And it's important to also say here that from now on we're referring to earnings using logged income, which I can explain if anybody is not sure about in questions. And this is expressed as a coefficient, which can be directly interpreted as a percentage. So for example here, when you get to model 5, with all of the different controls added, the stars indicate that there is a statistically significant relationship for all ranges of mobility, except for those whose parents did sort of lower professional managerial jobs, and that actually what that 8.97 means at the very bottom right of the Model 5 shows is that the long-range upwardly mobile are only earning 90% of what the stable are earning, even when we control for all of these variables. And to look at this in a perhaps slightly more, in a slightly different way, including actual earnings in pounds, and if you just look really at the top of the chart, what you can see is really that after controls, the long-range upwardly mobile, those from working class backgrounds are earning £115 less than the stable, $9,000 a year. Okay, certainly a very significant earnings gap, and one that we think points towards a powerful and, crucially in this regard, previously unrecognised class ceiling within Britain's top occupations. Now, while I've illustrated that the upwardly mobile face a significant pay penalty in Britain's elite occupations, it's important to sort of deepen this and to ask whether this disadvantage is more marked for certain social groups. And so here we looked at gender, we looked at ethnicity, we looked at age, and we looked at the 16 occupational groups. Now this slide demonstrates the dimension of ethnicity in relation to this, and what you can see is that the overall pattern for ethnic minorities appears similar to that of whites. Okay, we can see the most disadvantage for the long-range upwardly mobile. And just to explain what you're looking at here, the points are the income origin coefficients, okay, with the thick line, the 95% confidence interval, the 99% confidence interval is the thinner line, and significance is indicated if the line doesn't touch the 1. What I really want to flag here, though, and I think this is significant in a US context, is really that there are not enough ethnic minorities in top occupations in the UK. Only 311 in our sample, okay? Remember, this is 95,000 nationally representative survey, which I think is telling in itself, to really have any sort of sense of security about these particular findings. Okay, so I would urge much caution before sort of arguing that there is an intersection, a clear intersection between ethnicity and class, even if that is perhaps what we would expect to find, or we may find considering other research. Also to say, and again this is a result of that low sample size, that this is a very sort of basic way of looking at ethnicity, all ethnic minorities versus whites, and clearly in reality will hide very different, very specific differences by ethnic group. These are the models by gender. And what this really demonstrates, and I think we can say this with much more security, is that women face a very significant double disadvantage within elite occupations if they come from a working class background. So actually this figure shows that the class origin effect for women is actually smaller than that of men on its own, but of course women are earning less based on class and gender here. And that's perhaps easier to see if we just put it in these basic terms, which are looking at, again, class origins and earnings of men and women. And what you can see here when you look at long-range upwardly mobile women, the purple on the left compared with the red, purple on the left and the red on the right, is that upwardly mobile women have predicted earnings of a staggering £14,000, $21,000 less than otherwise similar intergenerationally stable men. And I think this is important to reiterate here. Okay, we're not in any way trying to suggest that the class ceiling is replacing the glass ceiling, but instead we're trying to show here the intersections between gender and class. In terms of age, what you can see here, or if it's a bit unclear, let me read it for you, is that pay penalties tend to be stronger the older you are in these jobs. And this really suggests two possible explanations. First, it could be a good news story, okay, that the class ceiling is declining across cohorts, or perhaps more plausibly, that the greater penalties experienced by those in their 50s could be the result of a cumulative sort of effect over the course of their careers. Okay, we don't have the ability to adjudicate between those two accounts, however. Finally, we want to examine, is this notion of a class ceiling uniform across all elite occupations, or is it marked in particular occupational arenas? And this shows you the coefficients, both in the base model and with all the controls added, in different elite occupations, okay? Separating people who have been socially mobile in any way from the stable. And what this really illustrates is that there are actually, again, striking levels of variation between different elite occupations. Okay? At the one end of the scale, engineering, okay, seems to provide, in terms of class anyway, a notable sort of exemplar of meritocracy. Not only is it relatively open in terms of access, as I showed earlier, but the pay gap between the stable and the long-range upwardly mobile is negligible. In contrast, what you can see here is the scale of disadvantage experienced by the children of the working classes in the traditional professions, okay, in law, in media, in medicine, in finance, even in academia to some extent here. And just to show you this again in quite basic terms, in terms of pounds, in finance, okay, for example, the predicted difference is an estimated annual pay gap of nearly £12,000, okay, $17,500 if you are socially mobile. Now, after that endless flurry of stats, I imagine the thing you actually really want me to answer is why? Why is this happening? Well, getting at this sort of black box of explanation is really the next step of our research, and something that, from our point of view, really requires in-depth qualitative inquiry. More specifically than that, we've been lucky enough to secure a grant which will allow us to conduct 4 occupational case studies to look at the drivers of the pay gap in elite professional service firms, in engineering, in broadcast media, and also in acting. Now, we've only just begun this qualitative work, but before I sort of conclude, what I want to do for the next 5 or 10 minutes is just share some insight from 47 fascinating interviews that we have recently conducted with British actors, okay, from different class backgrounds. Now, we felt acting was a sort of interesting site, or a salient site, for 3 reasons, really. I didn't mention it, or I didn't show you on the slides, but it's actually among the professions with the biggest class pay gap, okay, around £11,000 for those who are long-range upwardly mobile. Secondly, you may have seen in the headlines that class and acting has been a high-profile issue, okay. There's a widespread fear in the UK, at least, that the top echelons of the acting profession are increasingly dominated by the privileged, by elite educated actors like Tom Hardy, like Eddie Redmayne, like Benedict Cumberbatch. And finally, we think a class ceiling in acting is actually particularly problematic because of the role actors play in actually representing social reality on screen, and how these representations in turn then affect how we as audiences come to actually understand and see society. Now, unravelling the acting class pay gap really revealed 3 main factors. First and foremost was the profound occupational advantages afforded to actors who can draw upon the bank of mum and dad. Those with this kind of financial cushion we found, are insulated from much of the precarity and the uncertainty associated with acting, both in terms of negotiating the cost of living in London, where really most of the opportunities in acting are clustered, but more psychologically in terms of feeling like they can take more risks, spend more time on networking, even take unpaid work, all of which have long-term payoffs, okay, we were told. In contrast, actors who lack this familial support supported describing living the day-to-day reality of acting as a kind of economic chaos, or as Ray in this quote here aptly put it, like skydiving without a parachute. But it's not just about money. There was also a sense among the working class actors we spoke to that they had experienced barriers rooted in their class identity, in judgments about their class identity, about their appearance, about their taste, and very much, as I'll go on to say, about their accents. So just to introduce you to Jim, Jim described his background as very poor, and he spoke very eloquently about a snobbery he felt had profoundly affected his entire acting career. It began, he told us, when he was at drama school in Scotland. Not only did he immediately feel like a fish out of water, in his words, but this initial dislocation was heightened by the fact that the drama school's stated aim, in his words, was to break you down and build you back up again. But for Jim, this process of breaking felt like a direct attack on his working class identity, on his accent, on the way he expressed himself, even on the way he held his body. Okay? And his reaction was to resist. He told me, "I was just like, I won't be broken down." But this actually only caused more problems for him, and after 3 unhappy years, he narrowly escaped failing his degree. And Jim summed up this experience, and you can see on the quote here, as an assault. Now, this sense of stigma was most commonly reported, as I say, in relation to accent, which is really a very strong marker of class in the UK still today. And particularly this came out during auditions, according to these actors, okay, where you can see from the quotes on the board here that many grappled with the feeling of being looked down upon. And the focus actually here on voice and accent also relates to a more field-specific way that markers of middle-class identity are subtly institutionalised in British acting, particularly through the notion of received pronunciation. Okay, I know that term doesn't necessarily work in a US context, perhaps better known as sort of the Queen's English, okay, or maybe a plummy accent like my own, okay, gives you an indication of what I mean by received pronunciation. And respondents told us this is hammered into you if you're training to be an actor as the sort of vocal starting point of classical acting practice. But this also presented a barrier for working class actors who were perceived as lacking this natural RP intonation. So just to give you one example from the bottom of this slide here, this is Aidan. Aidan, who spoke with a broad northeast Geordie accent, had experienced the normative power of RP as a reoccurring obstacle in his career. He explained that in classical theatre, and particularly in productions of Shakespeare, regional accents, okay, in the UK, like his own, tend to be reserved only for the supplementary characters, okay, as a counterpoint, a foil, or as he notes here, the smaller comedy roles where you have to take the piss out of yourself to get the audience on side. But Aidan told us that over time, he'd come to see this as actually deeply offensive, okay, a process through which he was being continually asked to mock his heritage to get work, where he said, it just feels like prostitution. So the construction of RP as the neutral voice of British acting may appear as a sort of innocuous professional practice, but what these interviews illustrated was really that it's become a sort of powerful marker of what we might call embodied cultural capital in a Bourdieusian sense, that tacitly designates middle-class voices as having a greater natural right to occupy space within the profession. Finally, there was the issue of typecasting, by which I mean actors auditioning for roles that follow a set social type that reflects their real-life demographic characteristics: age, gender, ethnicity, region, class, etc. Now, most acknowledge that actually typecasting was useful, okay? It provides a set of defined roles where these actors have comparative advantage. But there was a sense among working class actors, particularly those who were female and or from black and minority ethnic backgrounds, that there are actually far few roles written for their social type. Okay, I know this is an issue that's currently being played out in a Hollywood context, but just to give you, just to introduce you to Deborah here, she explained her enduring frustration with the limitations of her casting type as a mixed-race woman from a working class background. She says here, I'm a black character actress in my 40s and there's just not a lot of stuff out there. I've played a hell of a lot of nurses. I've played more nurses than there are in the whole of St George's Hospital, okay, which is a very large hospital in London. Mia recounted a similar story. She explained that her career had largely involved playing a narrow range of secondary characters. Okay, she said, and I quote, the battered wife, the junkie, someone who has lost a child because of their badness. I always get cast as working class victims. Now, Mia was clearly uncomfortable with this, but at the same time, she was realistic about her basic need to work. As she summed up, and I quote, I'm not exactly being flooded with other options. Now, the stories of Mia and Deborah then underline a sort of professional bind frequently faced by the working class actors we spoke to, particularly those who were female or BME in a UK context. While they often objected to the gendered, raced or classed representations they were actually being asked to portray, their ability to actually reject this work was simultaneously weakened by the restricted supply of roles available to them. And I think this last point is significant in terms of the wider talk today, because it indicates that this notion of the class ceiling, the class pay gap, at least in acting, may not just be the result of the different resources that actors or those in other professions bring with them into the professions they work in, but also that the occupations themselves may be structurally skewed to better reward certain types of people. In this case, actors who are white, male, and middle class. At the same time, clearly these are very specific factors to acting, okay? And in no way am I saying that these relate to the other professions necessarily, but nonetheless, what I hope this sort of short qualitative snapshot has given you is a flavour, really, of how and why this notion of a class pay gap may exist in particular occupational settings. Okay, so I know I've bombarded you with a lot of material. So I thought it might be useful just to finish by summarising the main points and discussing some possible implications. So first, we found here clear variation in the social composition of different elite occupations, particularly between traditional professions in the UK, medicine and law in particular, and what we might call sort of technical elite professions, such as engineering and IT, that appear anyway to recruit much more widely. Second, though, even when those from non-professional and managerial backgrounds are successful in entering many of these top jobs, okay, they face a powerful class ceiling in terms of earnings, which third is significantly exacerbated for women coming from working class backgrounds. Moreover, this pay gap actually very much persists even after controlling for a whole range of important factors that are thought to affect earnings. So this, we believe, points to really quite a worrying and, as I said previously, unobserved disadvantage within some of Britain's most prestigious and highly paid occupations, particularly, and I can talk a bit more, in finance and accountancy if you're interested. And very finally, I suppose, we also want to flag two important implications we think this work has for mobility studies, class analysis. The first is really we believe that our analysis demonstrates that a person's class destination, okay, their actual class position is never fully captured by either the dominant big class variables used by research or even the micro class variables. Okay, for example, our results suggest that a Glasgow lawyer, okay, earning £50,000 a year, whose parents were factory workers, does not meaningfully have the same class destination as a City of London lawyer earning £75,000 a year who was raised in a family of lawyers. Indeed, for us, a full understanding of class destination really must take into account a range of indicators of social position of resources. And in this way, we believe that examining income and occupation in tandem, as we've done here, represents one of those ways forward. Second, and perhaps most significantly, we think we've shown here that existing social mobility research really fundamentally fails to capture the persistent impact of class origin in shaping people's occupational trajectories. That it fails to grasp the stickiness of class origin or its long shadow, as Annette Leroux has recently written. To some, this might seem like a banal observation. Okay, after all, qualitative research has long highlighted that class identities tend to always carry, at least in some shape or form, the symbolic baggage of their past. But in the dominant quantitative arena of social mobility, sensitivity to this linger of class origin is almost always absent. So in this regard, we believe that by drawing on the feminist concept of a glass ceiling may act as a vital means of sharpening the tools of class analysis. In particular, it provides a strategy with which researchers can begin, as we've done here, to really interrogate the hidden class barriers within prestigious occupations and the ways in which fundamentally it pays to be privileged. Thank you.
Well, I will have a cue, and you can start asking questions. I rarely do this, but I'm going to actually start rather than end. One of the questions I had, given all the data that you've established up here, is you have this variation, so you have this mobility into a class, or into an occupation. And then the issue is the question is, why do you get these differences that actually emerge? And there are two things that come up in the data itself, and particularly in the last sequences of your interview. One is the idea that there's something carried on from class to actually these new occupations. Those could be cultural things, carried on language, ways of behaving, ways of dressing, etc. And or in the more classic sort of way, not just that it's the way of dressing or language, but it's actually the way you would go about doing that job of that occupation given your cultural background. That's the only way in which you can demonstrate, in my judgment, that there's some kind of continuance from where you started. But the other thing on the other side is separating out that from the other side, which is that the other class socialization that then prejudices and then discriminates about who will get the occupation, that is the segments within it, is what's the other side of this. So you have these two bookends. So they're both actually class drawn. They're both actually bringing class to the population. And yes, you can see this in your analysis of an artist, or in some kinds of actor and actresses. But the more difficult one is to see this in a particular kind of profession. That is exactly what would they look like, and what would they mean, and how would they translate ultimately in either going forward and being mobile, intra-mobile, as well as being deprived of them. And you don't have a measurement for that. And without that measurement, in my judgment, it's very difficult to actually sustain your argument completely, even if you see these on the outside, because we don't know with this in this data what actually is the interaction term between those two.
Yeah. I mean, I think something we didn't show here, partly because it's a little bit technical, is something called a decomposition analysis that we did on this data, and which shows you sort of what measured attributes of the upwardly mobile may account for the variation we find here. And what that shows you is you can account for some things. So part of the difference is accounted for by education qualifications, okay? The stable, the privileged tend to be slightly better qualified. They're also curiously the fact that the stable are more likely to work in London, and they are more likely to work in large firms, both of which, unsurprisingly, are associated with higher earnings. But as you say, again, it doesn't necessarily get at the sort of the explanatory, what's actually happening here. And that's what I was sort of hoping that the that the qualitative inquiry will try to get at, but it is at this point sort of unexplained. One interesting sort of aspect that has been talked about in relation to other studies of professions in the UK is this idea that there are certain traits that are seen as markers of talent, as ability, but are actually, very much elements of cultural baggage. And one that is used routinely in finance in the UK, particularly in recruitment to big firms, is this notion of polish. Are you polished? What does polished mean? It's it's something that is a vessel that the person making the decision can pour all sorts of cultural baggage into. And I think what some other work which we're going to try and sort of follow up on is saying is really that what polish means is all the embodied aspects of class that are then misrecognized as talent and then seen as a legitimate means of rewarding someone or promoting someone, which then leads to the pay gap.
Okay, I got a nice cue here. Yes.
Thank you for the talk. I think my question really follows up on Martin's point. I wanted to know if in the interviews, if you're planning to talk to employers also, I'm wondering about, in particular, what kind of class signaling they look for. So from my experience in the US, I would think of things like where you actually got your degree, even degree, what does that signal? Social ties and network connections that can lead to someone getting a job.
Yeah.
And then maybe also if there isn't perhaps some assumptions about kind of what would be a comfortable wage for you to earn, right? Like, is it appropriate to offer you something at the lower end of the spectrum and for you to then, maintain your current lifestyle given that based on assumptions, from looking at someone's resume?
Yeah.
So I'm curious if you're going to be looking at that side as well.
Yeah, I mean, thank you. That's good. That's a great question, and the answer is yes. Although to some extent there's a little bit of flexibility on how we design these 3 occupational case studies. My immediate thought was to look at the sort of ceiling aspect and to pick a sort of symbolically significant sort of point in the career trajectory. Maybe board level, something like that, and actually look at interviewing, as you say, people who are actually gatekeeping entry to those and see what they are, both how they've recruited people in the past and what's made a good candidate and what's in that, and what they're looking for moving forward. And I think those factors that you mentioned will definitely be sort of themes that we'll want to explore with those interviewees. I mean, I think one issue which speaks to both the gatekeeper and the individual is this idea about pay and pay negotiation, and both, and of course this has been talked about, very fruitfully in relation to the gender pay gap, about who asks for pay rises, who expects, who believes that they are, have a sort of right to a certain amount of money, and how does the employer read the person, in what they offer and the strategies that goes on, because in the UK at least, people don't know what each other earn, and it's a very secretive sort of issue, and so there's room for people to be doing the same job and be earning very different amounts. Yeah.
Sean?
Sure. So I love it, and I'm disappointed you didn't show the blinder will hop in and compensate results, but we can talk about that later. What I think is the most important result from this is the distinction amongst categories of jobs, particularly as you have split them technical and sort of traditional professional. But there are a lot of differences between those broad categories, particularly the capital that you need to enter the law or medical professions to be very different. Engineers are done after undergrad. And so the real question here is, what do you think drives that result? And also, and this is only a somewhat serious question, I don't believe markets always work, but why isn't the market sorting this out? Why isn't, I mean, law firms face a brutally competitive market. If they can hire better talent and pay them half of that difference in class pay disparity, then they could do as good of a job for less money.
Yeah.
And recruit better lawyers. So
Yeah.
why isn't that?
Yeah, really good. I mean, just to answer that, I mean, the interesting thing about this work is that we've managed to, I think, in answer to your question, we got quite a lot of press coverage for these results, and lots of sort of contact from firms, and wanting to, exactly that thing. I mean, from a competitive sort of perspective, if they are inefficient and they can see that this is a sign of inefficiency, then how can they fix it? And obviously we have different agendas for wanting to sort of sort this out, but it might help in terms of access to organizations for doing this research. But I think that it's only just becoming an issue that's sort of becoming mainstream enough that people are understanding the logic. I suppose if you ask why not, it's probably that people haven't just find this a little bit hard to believe completely. I think the issue of the gender pay gap probably, and its incredible sort of political success, probably helps very much with the logic of getting this into the mainstream and making people realize that it's an issue that needs to be thought about in the same way. Yeah. So I think, what I would imagine in terms of the question of why is it happening in that regard is probably, there's a scholar in the US called Lauren Rivera who's written a great book recently called Pedigree, which is looking at access and these issues around class origin in terms of access. And I think she talks a lot about this issue of cultural matching. So people just recognizing and rewarding those who look and sound like themselves, and not seeing that there might be issues with that, because and I think maybe the issue of why did firms not recognize this is that the people in positions of power just haven't thought that they haven't thought until you put really robust data in front of them, which I hope this is, that they have a problem.
Frank?
Yeah, so two questions. One's really quick, and that's whether or not they top code the income data here, which would make the differences possibly larger. A lot of surveys top code. And then, you passed over this kind of quickly, but you can see where I can see where these kinds of studies can make gender the only condition that matters, or race the only condition that matters, and eliminate the effect of the wealth in the background, the wealth of your parents that can buy you certain things. But I think you can't do that here just by the nature of the way you're choosing people. So in professions, you often have to buy your way into a practice. But certainly in the United States, and I would imagine it's the same thing in Britain. So if you work for the National Health Service, you don't have to buy your way in, but if you want to work for a practice that has a private component outside of the National Health Service, then you probably have to buy your way into the partnership or the practice. That's very standard in the United States. You can you can buy a doctor's practice and start off with a substantial income right away. The doctor retires or he has an overflow of patients. And can you control for that? I mean, that might explain why the legal and the medical professions were particularly problematic here, and the engineering professions were not.
Yeah. we can't control for it in terms of this data, unfortunately, in terms of not having information about wealth. But if you're asking, is that a sort of important part of the story? I very much believe it is, and I think the notion of buying in the way that you mentioned, I think makes sense. But I think in terms of it can also make sense in more banal ways in relation to the way in which the data is taking us. So one of the big findings here is about being able to work in London, being able to get access to the higher salaries in London. Who can live in London? Increasingly, I don't know if any of you have been to London in the last few years, if you want to rent a room, if you want to buy a home, someone here who would one day hope to buy a home in London, you need a huge amount of capital. And that means that some people who have that capital behind them in terms of their families are much more able to choose that job or take that job in London, which then gives them access to the higher salaries. So I think it's absolutely part of the story. We can't look at it directly in terms of this data. Again, it's something I'd hope to explore in the same way as we showed Bank of Mum and Dad in relation to acting, how it operates in the ways that you mentioned in other professions. I'm not sure we use the term top coding in the UK. What?
So in lots of surveys in the United States, in order to maintain confidentiality, they'll top code.
So
if you have an income over $150,000,
yes, yeah,
you're top coded at $150,000, which means that a lot of that distinction at the upper end is lost.
Yeah. I believe the same thing is the case in this data. I'm not sure exactly what that top figure is, and I'd have to go back to the sort of the data appendix in the ASR paper. But I'm pretty sure it's the same thing because Daniel and I were talking about this very recently. So I agree. I think there's an element to which some of these results are actually, could be underestimating the differences.
Yeah. I mean, there might be a different way around it.
Yeah.
Using medians and stuff like that. But
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation. I was really interested in the double disadvantage at working class origin in the case, but I think that you addressed that question because I was wondering how much the negotiation process and negotiating those first salaries is going to contribute to that long shadow of class origin. So I'll move on to this idea of college, which I think is also really interesting, and the case that you have about acting. Sometimes we tend to think of, well, class you can pass more easily, you can hide it, but there are all of these markers, the accent, or maybe the teeth are a little bit crooked, or some other physical issue that you need to sort out, or even in this country, you have all this kind of middle America, or people getting rid of their accents to be able to be newscaster on television. But I'm wondering, as an ethnographer, if there's any opportunity to expand this further in terms of observing these informal. I'm thinking about, I don't know if there's a difference in these occupations in terms of the amounts of informal socializing that people are doing. So, like kind of workplace dinners and after drinks, and are we like kind of hanging out? And so this idea of how much is a person able to fit in or not? Do they have this cultural capital that they can use, or do they kind of have to show up when they feel uncomfortable? Okay, the minute this is done, I'm going to go home now.
Yeah, I've thought long and hard about whether we could meaningfully and usefully build in an ethnographic component to this follow-up work, because I think you're absolutely right that something along those lines are really important in understanding what goes on sort of outside the workplace, but it's absolutely pivotal to notions of being seen as the right sort of person for the firm to move on, and building those relationships in the pub in the UK context. I'm just not sure whether we'd be able to, there's a clear enough sort of site to be able to do that. One idea we had was to sort of maybe follow a cohort, a small cohort of sort of graduates who've entered a firm, and then sort of try and track their experience over two or 3 years. But I'm just not sure how easy it would be to even get at ethnographically those pivotal moments where the boss there's an informal drink that goes on, you know, or capture those conversations that are being had. But then I'm not really an ethnographer, so
I don't either, but
it would be,
obviously the data is
yeah. I mean,
different directions.
it would be fantastic to talk about, you know, with somebody who's
also works in Los Angeles, so there's of, you know, acting and
yeah. I mean,
it's endlessly fascinating to me.
yes,
Okay.
yeah. Thank you.
Mayo.
Yes, that was a great talk. I keep wondering if there isn't any value to looking not simply at upward social mobility, but to look at downward social mobility, and wonder if the people who are downwardly mobile still keep some sort of advantage, right? So they don't fall as low as the people from that other grade or that other class who have been stable, right? So what
Yeah, the cement floor.
Exactly.
I think again. I mean, it feels to me like it's part of the same story. It's probably a different project, but it's definitely something that I'm sort of fascinated by as a concept, because I think it you know, if we are to sort of really understand what's going on here, it is the other side of the coin, and I suppose it would be again about trying to conceptualize a study where you could meaningfully get at that. There has been some work in the UK that's tried to look at it using lots of different quantitative variables. Interestingly, we did look here at sort of earnings in terms of downward mobility, and we didn't find a clear sense that the downwardly mobile had, you know, if you've been downwardly mobile into, I don't know, being a plumber or an electrician, are you still earning more money than those who've come from? And we didn't actually find that there were statistically significant differences. But again, it feels like a less easy thing to conceptualize quantitatively in the way that we did here, and that's perhaps explains, because I think the logic still makes me think there is a way in which you would keep some baggage that would advantage you in certain ways. But
David.
I had two questions. One, I thought it was interesting you chose actors to illustrate your argument about a pay gap, because most actors I know have day jobs. I mean, especially Shakespearean actors. I mean, maybe you could restate that, your example again, summarize. But my larger question has to do with the place of the university as an institution mediating mobility. Maybe it's in your larger explanation, but it seems to me that, well, obviously here in the U.S. it plays a major role. We have something sometimes called affirmative action or lack thereof. I mean, it makes me wonder about UK. I mean, is there any class-based affirmative action? Does that make a difference?
yeah, I mean, there's. I'll try and see if I can answer those backwards. There is an increasing sort of access agenda. It's not called affirmative action, but widening access in relation to class origin and university attendance in the UK. But I don't think it's anywhere near as, it feels often like it's, I mean, in my university, for instance, London School of Economics, where the students, there's inordinately high fees, they have a widening access program. To me, it feels very much like a sort of tokenistic gesture. So in terms of its real ability to alter these processes, I don't think it's really doing much. I think, and one of the things that we're not able to look at here are some of the more meaningful ways you might mine down into how education is part of the story here. So we can't see, for instance, the name of the institution, which is hugely important in a UK context, just like it is in the US. Interestingly, we do have some other data, which is from something called the Great British Class Survey, which was not representative, but a huge sample survey done with the BBC, which had 325,000 responses. And there we were able to look at both the name of the institution and whether they went to a private secondary school or not, which is also very significant in a UK context in relation to this idea of polish and deportment in relation to class. And both of those things, we find a class pay gap in that data, and then we find that both private schooling and Oxbridge, so Oxford and Cambridge, hugely affects that pay gap and that control. So absolutely, and it's a shame that that this data doesn't have that ability, because I think that would be very much part of the story.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. My question goes on what Stacey was saying back about, well, my question specifically is, how much of it is how seriously do you take the metaphor of the ceiling? Glass ceiling implies that, and I'm not like really, I don't know that much about the literature about discrimination among women. But it implies that you run into a limit and you can't get past that. And even the data you showed, compared women to men, showed that even women with a high class background still ran up against something. They didn't get very far in terms of their earnings. So I guess the question you could phrase it in terms of among the people with a lowly class origin, is there what is the kind of the spread? Are there some people who do actually attain the higher level? Are there a lot of people who do attain the higher levels in terms of employment within their occupation versus others who are stuck at the bottom? Or is it that you just don't see, you see very, very few people from low class origin? And I ask that because it's intuitive, right? If you're a woman, you can't perform the characteristics that are valued, the masculine characteristics that are not valued, because you'll still be judged as, who does she think she is? Acting like a boss, versus if you're from a lower class background, if you can perform, you can speak the right way, if you're familiar with the show Mad Men, the main character is the guy with a lower class background, but it doesn't matter. He performs perfectly, his role. Is it a ceiling at all?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. I mean, we originally called this work, and the title was The Class Ceiling, and we changed it because I don't think we really are looking. It's not accurate, really, empirically, to say that this is a ceiling. In the UK, anyway, the notion of a glass ceiling is often used to just when people talk about the gender pay gap, they use the word glass ceiling. But I think it's much better to call it a pay gap. We're looking at average earnings here. What we are going to try and do next is to look at some longitudinal data to look at what point in occupational trajectories is this gap opening up, because then perhaps if you can see that it's something that's very much happening at a certain point, then you might say, well, there is a ceiling, there is this sort of board level point where you can fake it to a certain point in using but the board level there is a real closed shop, old boys network, and they can detect your Don Draper, and the fact that he's not he's not really a Harvard boy, So I think that's an empirical question and absolutely central to our follow-up to be able to answer it. But it's a good question, very much so. Yeah.
Anyone? Oh, okay.
Thank you. I enjoyed your talk. It strikes me that in England, would it be the case, do you think, that with the received pronunciation, your comments about that were very interesting to me, because I think throughout Britain, it's basically the same accent that is widely recognised as being that of being better educated, etc., more so than other countries. I was wondering if there were other data, if you've done any comparative work. And also, I thought about the very British institution of the pub and going to have alcohol very frequently in the evening, and the fact that it's such a prevalent practice would seem to me to work to make things sometimes more difficult for people who perhaps had family priorities, etc. And I wondered if this institution exists as much in other European contexts, for example, to such an extent where alcohol can be so central to office socializing in the pub. Just two small points.
Yeah, really. So the comparative question is that's what we're doing right now. So we've got data from Norway, which is interesting in the context of sort of sort of society that builds itself as highly egalitarian. France and the US, and we're doing a sort of comparative paper using quantitative measures to see whether the class pay gap, how it corresponds in those countries. So watch this space. There should be some work on that coming soon. On that front, I suppose, without really speculating, but I think you're right about the sort of particularly the role of alcohol and in the UK, and how much sort of behind the scenes relationship building goes on in that context, and therefore whether that accentuates in that context people from similar backgrounds sort of coming together and making alliances that advantage themselves in the workplace. I think your other point, I don't know if this was connected, but you were talking about whether some people can't go to the pub because they've got family commitments, what have you. And I think there might be something, again, if you were to look at sort of average ages for people having children and look at that by class, that might have something to play there. So that's an interesting theory. I can't answer it because we don't have that data here, but that's an interesting theory and might be worth looking into. Thank you.
Thanks for a fascinating talk. I'm wondering, we seem to go from this pretty macro level story about seeing class pay gap, more of a anecdotes or I'm wondering if from your data we can say much about what's happening in between, and specifically I'm thinking to what extent is this class pay gap self-selection, like people from low class backgrounds might go into the same occupation as people from high class backgrounds, but they choose the ones that are less urban or pay not so nice, or maybe perhaps are friendlier to their different family obligations or whatever. And to what extent might it be from the employer angle of simply getting the promotion the person has a better accent or?
Yeah. No, so that's, I suppose that in some ways you're cutting to the heart of what the qualitative inquiry is going to try to do, which is to look at, whether it's demand or supply, or it's obviously both, but to look at, but to what extent is either driving the picture more or less. And for me, the point about acting is really to say this is probably massively occupationally specific, this effect, and it's happening differently in different occupations, and so it's really important to dig in really, in a really detailed way to 3 or 4, and then really look at whether there are commonalities between those case studies, and where there are differences, why are there differences, and do those differences relate to demand and supply. But I think in terms of what we can say from this particular data, I would say that your initial statement about the fact that the upwardly mobile perhaps choose less lucrative specialisms within occupations is possibly an important factor. And I think to some extent that's definitely something that we'd want to follow up on. Thank you.
But it also depends on what the nature of the demand and the supply is. So if you even when we use those in economics, it hides some things that are sociological about the relationship in the market. So for example, the assumption is that you take this person who doesn't speak quite right, and that the person doesn't take them because, where you said it, they recognize somebody and they like what they recognize. That is, they like an accent much like theirs. Well, that's one possibility or a hypothesis that you're employing on why the person chose or discriminated and chose one person over another. The other option is that it's actually somebody says, oh, I recognize this and I'm reducing my risk. That is, I know what I'm getting when I have somebody with this particular kind of background, and I don't know what I'm getting with somebody else. The same thing can be said about the nature of what institution you went to. So in some particular way, the demand that is the demand for a person who could do whatever I'm talking about, is related actually to the kinds of things of one, reducing risk, so you get actually a much more higher return, or at least a return that you can actually account for.
I think this is a really, really important point. One of the reasons why we're focusing on elite professional service firms, your KPMGs and etc., is that a lot of the work that goes on there is client-facing, and so who you are is huge. To some extent, you are selling yourself as the product and building those relationships with the clients. And so, to some extent, it becomes about what the client wants, what the client thinks is talent. So, what you may find from employers is, like you say, someone saying, "I'm employing that person, and I know I'm employing them for reasons that aren't strictly meritocratic, but I know my clients, and my clients think that an Oxbridge accent is more reliable, so I'm reducing my risk." So I'm complicit in creating this class inequality, but I've got a logic for it that I still feel is sort of legitimate, or sort of.
Or or you're making a distinction on the issue of human capital. There's a level of human capital that you think actually the person's going to bring. And remember, there's a loss. So if you choose wrong, then it is a matter of, the fact is, then you might have to lay them off. Then you got dead time, in which you're not, in which you re-employ again, in which you don't actually have any income coming in, or you have no production. Let's put it that way in economic terms. So there's a lot of things that's going on that a lot of these explanations in social stratification uses, particularly at RC28, that actually miss some of the actual microdynamics that are terribly significant, that are not necessarily micro in the sense that we understand. They are micro in the sense that they're not at the structural level there, but they are at a structural level which has to do with the marketplace, which is what Sean said in the first place. But the market is, in some particular way, is active in this. And in that regard, the question really becomes, what role is that in relationship to this?
Yeah.
Because if you control out for this, like you can control out for ethnicity, etc., or then the real question is, the wage gap which women have in America at the higher levels, at the higher professional levels, because employers say they're going to get pregnant, and I'm going to have downtime because while this is happening. So why would I hire them in the first place? And it's not so funny, because we know we have this quantitative data that shows these wage gaps that are huge for women in the United States. And the question really becomes, it isn't like it is unfair. We're all agreeing to that. And it is discriminatory. We're all agreeing to that. But the real question is, what's it based on? And in that particular case, is it actually based on some real economics, both of which are true. And in other words, it is true they'll have downtime. It is true that they'll have production costs. All those are real true. And the question somebody says is, well, should we, or should we require them to come back immediately after they give birth?
Yeah. No. I think the question, I suppose, is to try and is to try and uncover these things, and then write about them and see what people do with it politically in that regard. And I think maybe the difference from the having children, example is maybe that in relation to some of these class aspects around things like polish, the logic of the notion that it's meaningfully measuring human capital, that's a meaning. It may in one moment be seen as a legitimate form of human capital, but it might be, but it's a sort of, it's very much not in a sort of if we think about something like polish, it just feels like something that's very easily disassembled if the occupational culture works, it moves in a particular direction. And I suppose that would be maybe a difference between those two, but I don't know yet. I mean, that's part of the reason.
And you have the rest of dinner to. So thank you very much for a wonderful collaboration.
Thank you very much.
We'll have more time to talk.
Yeah.
I said to Sam, thank you for inviting me for the dinner, but it happens to be my birthday.